Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Curry. I'm a journalist based in Berlin, and I'm here today to introduce a great group of panelists to talk about forests and the future of forests and how climate change in the next decades is really going to impact our forests and what we can do about that. We're here as part of the Falling Walls Circle Tables. These are sessions designed to bring top researchers and policymakers together, either at single tables or as part of a larger discussion to connect science to ways we can make concrete change to solve the problems that are pressing on our world today. The topic today, forests, isn't always one that we give enough attention to, but forests occupy a huge amount of Europe's land area. A third of Europe is forests. They account for tremendous amounts of biodiversity, whether you're talking about forests in Europe or the Amazon rainforest. And across the world, they're really threatened by changes to the climate, whether it's from the increase in drought frequency and severity, forest disturbances from pest problems like the bark beetles that are threatening German forests here, or wildfires that have been in the news this year all across the world. And our panelists today are experts in both understanding how forests work and also understanding the impacts of forest disturbances and forest degradation on the future of forests, and coming up with ways that we can do something about those changes. I'd like to introduce the panel. We have Jürgen Bauhaus from the University of Freiburg. He's the chair of silviculture there. Next to him is Markus Linder, who is the principal scientist of the European Forest Institute and an expert in forests and resilience and how we can make our forests more resilient. And finally, Andreas Huth from the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig, who has done amazing work on modeling how forests work down to individual trees in the Amazon as part of a computer model that looks at changes in that rainforest and what they can bring in the future. I'd like to start with giving Jürgen Bauhaus a chance to talk a little bit about the work he's been doing, and then we'll turn to the other two panelists to give short introductions to their work, and then open up a discussion on forests in the future. So Jürgen, could you talk a little bit about what you're working on?
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, as you have pointed out already, climate change is upon us, and it is impacting greatly on forests. We see disturbances such as through fires, droughts, bark beetles in a magnitude, intensity, and frequency as we have not experienced it before. And that, of course, threatens forests. And not only forests, but also the ecosystem services that they provide, and thus our human well-being. Thus, The research that we do here is based on that premise that we need to adapt forests to make sure that they will also in future provide the important ecosystem services that we as a society require and want from forests. So there are two lines of research that we follow. One is really adaptation in the long term. Forests are long-lived ecosystems, or the trees are long-lived, thus all the changes that happen in forests and things that we can do to forests in terms of adaptation take time. It's not as in agriculture where you can change completely your options every year. So for the long term, we're looking at which species can be or will be maybe suitable to these future conditions. So we're looking at rare tree species that we've looked at in the past, not well enough, and what role they can play in future forests. We look at replacement species for economically important species that we have currently. You mentioned the bark beetle catastrophe that we see here in Europe, which affects mostly Norway spruce, which is, again, the economically most important species that we have here. And it's the backbone of the forest industry. So we're looking at which other conifer species, such as, for example, the native silver fir or the introduced Douglas fir, may be better suited to future conditions. We also look at the functioning of tree species mixtures and to what extent they can not only spread the risk compared to monospecific forests, but also what other benefits they offer in terms of providing ecosystem services and also enhancing the resistance and resilience in relation to these different types of disturbances. These long-term things cannot be implemented in all forests. So we look at also what we can do in the short term to existing forests and make them more resistant and resilient. And we look at things such as thinning to increase the vitality of individual trees so they are less susceptible to drought. So in short term, long term, and short term options to enhance the resistance and resilience of forests to face these future extreme events and disturbances. That's what we do in our research.
Okay, thank you so much. I forgot to mention earlier, we have an audience tuning in from around the world, and I encourage everybody watching to post questions in the chat, and we'll be able to address those directly to our experts as we go through the panel. Maybe next, Andreas, you could talk a little bit about the modeling work you do in the tropics and how it can be used to inform policy on forests.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So in my research group, we are interested in several questions. So we are interested in the growth or the dynamics of forests, and composition is related also to the carbon balance of forests. So for this, we use the knowledge which we have about key processes in forest ecosystems, and we introduce them in forest simulation models. And this we do in combination with field data and also with remote sensing. So the remote sensing topic becomes more and more important. So especially for the tropics, we don't have so much field data information in the tropics, so we need other possibilities to get information about this current state, about the current disturbances in tropical forests, about deforestation, about degradation. And we try also to work with other scientific groups on new remote sensing techniques. So there are these classical optical satellites, but you can use also radar satellites, and there we have a strong cooperation with the German Aerospace Agency, DLR, which use radar satellites. And with radar satellites, you can try to detect or to get out from satellites information about forest use in additional steps to derive estimates for the disturbance state of the forest, or even to try to derive estimates for the above ground biomass of the forest. In the end, one of our main topics is really to try to analyze the carbon balances of forests, and for this we combine these different information sources, so from field data, from remote sensing, and introduce them into forest models to get a full picture about the role of different processes and the role of forest structure and species composition on the carbon balance of the forest. So the question here is, under which condition is the forest a carbon sink, and under which situation carbon source? And we had in 2018, 2019, for example, these drought years in Germany. And again, currently we work on a larger project in which we use the German National Forest Inventory from 2012 and simulate now using the measured weather data to analyze how the growth of the forest changed in the years 2018, 2019. And we got the result that our first estimates indicate that there are higher decreases in the productivity of the forest, so in the order of 16% for the drought year 2018. So this is just the first short overview about our research topics. Thanks.
Okay. I was also, you told me earlier that 2.5% of German forests were lost just in 2018 and 2019, which was sort of a shocking statistic.
Yes.
Last but not least,
sorry, I didn't got your
that not just 60% of productivity lost, but 2.5% of the forests themselves were lost in those two drought years.
Yeah. So two different numbers. So it's clear. So this we got from the around 2.5% of the forest area has died. So these are official numbers, and this estimates about the reduction in forest productivity. This is a result from our work combining remote sensing and forest modeling.
Okay. And last but not least, Marcus, maybe you can talk about your work and give us a little introduction into how you look at forest disturbance and what we can do about them.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'm working at the European Forest Institute, and we study how climate change is affecting forests and across Europe, and what we can do to adapt forest management in response. And first of all, it's important to stress that climate change is actually affecting forests very differently in different parts of Europe. So there are some parts like Northern Europe or also higher elevations in mountains where we expect that climate warming and longer growing seasons are actually increasing productivity. Whereas in other regions, we see that the extended drought and increased disturbance that Jürgen already stressed are then actually more than compensating for the benefits of longer growing seasons. But we have to understand that the situation is very, very different across Europe. We have very diverse environmental conditions, different forest types, different management regimes, which are traditionally used in forestry. And this all results in a very high variability also in how we can actually potentially then respond to the changing climate. So we have to really understand that there's no single best strategy how to react to climate change, but we need to adapt different strategies which are suiting the local conditions. And these are very different if we have a close to nature forestry regime like in Central Europe compared to plantation forestry, which we see, for example, in Southwest France or in Ireland. So one thing that is actually quite generalizable is that almost all the European forests are exposed more by disturbances now. They're affected more by wildfire, by insect outbreaks. Also, we have storm damages, which are not necessarily getting more frequent, but in the intense storms we see also more damage in the forest. And what we have learned in our work with at the Science Policy Practice Interface, which we are working at the European Forest Institute, we are working together with practitioners and with policymakers and try to learn on how we can actually respond to the challenges. And one big part of our work in the last few years has been to advocate for improved response to disturbance risks and to try to set up what we call a European Forest Risk Facility, where we learn from the experiences how we can actually better respond to the increased disturbances in European forests. And what is important here is that we need to really come to a paradigm shift. We can't really just only respond to disturbances as what was the common practice in the past, when we always try to suppress fire or try to minimize any kind of disturbance after they happened. But we have to understand that after the last disturbance is before the next, and we should really pay more attention to what we can do to proactively mitigate future disturbance impacts, how we can actually prevent some of the disturbance from happening. And when we have a large catastrophe, like at the moment the bark beetle outbreak and the dieback of many spruce forests, we have to think on how can we actually recover the forest after the disturbances and build a better, more resilient forest for the future.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great start, and we already have some questions coming in, including one that I wanted to talk about myself, which is the growing importance, it sounds like, of actively managing forests. And I think, Marcus, you mentioned close to nature forestry or close to nature silviculture, which is a growing movement in Germany. Maybe you could explain how that works, and then what are some of the other management techniques in a concrete sense that need to be changed or should be introduced more widely?
Well, maybe I can start, and then Jürgen can certainly chip in there as well. So I think in the last 20, 30 years almost, we had a trend in many Central European countries where we try to move away from secondary monocultures of conifers and try to enrich them with more diverse species mixtures and to use natural regeneration more actively and to develop more structurally diverse forest stands, which are hopefully also then more resilient to cope with different future challenges like disturbances. But a very important notion that needs to be stressed here is that so far our species that we worked with were kind of suitable for our environment conditions, but we are now with the climate change and these very extreme drought events that we experienced, we don't really have this certainty anymore that our existing natural species are going to cope with the climate that we are now experiencing, and especially with those extreme events. So we need to look also how we can widen the portfolio of species, like Jürgen mentioned before. We will have sites where our current natural species are no longer going to be suitable in the future. And this is also then giving a kind of a problem for the close to nature forest management paradigm, because so far this management approach did not really very much look into artificially regenerating species, which may be better suited for a future climate.
And when you say artificially regenerating, do you mean tree planting?
Yeah, it's either seeding or planting. So,
okay.
But Jürgen, you are still the cultural professor, so maybe you should rather complement this a bit.
Yeah, I think some of the major goals of this close to nature forest management were, on the one side, to use as much as possible natural processes, also to save costs, and allow forestry actually to be profitable in difficult economic times, and at the same time use all these principles of our understanding of ecosystems to increase the resistance and resilience of forests, to increase the species richness, tree species richness, to increase the structural diversity of forests, to promote natural structures such as dead wood in the forest, old trees, and so on. Some of these are sort of later developments in this approach of close to nature forest management, which is, I'd say, roughly 90 years old now. But as Markus has mentioned, this approach is also sort of coming to its limits. Some of the developments that we have seen in close to nature forest management was to view disturbances, natural disturbances, basically like an accident, something that we should avoid at all costs if possible, coming from an economic perspective. And we see now that obviously disturbances are inevitable, and they have always been a part of natural ecosystem dynamics. And so we need to rethink also this part of close to nature forest management, how we integrate disturbances better into our management and use these opportunities to reorganize the forests, to use these situations when the canopy is removed, to bring in species that we otherwise may not be able to regenerate under a closed canopy, species that are more light demanding and at the same time more drought tolerant, such as oaks, for example. That is one thing. Another thing that may have to change in this approach of close to nature forest management is that often the goal was to have very high growing stocks, meaning a lot of biomass on the area, and to let trees grow very tall and big. And we see now that it's particularly old trees, tall trees, that suffer from the effects of climate change, that are more susceptible to drought and bark beetles and so on. And therefore, one avenue of risk management for forestry is to basically try and develop trees somewhat quicker, so that they reach the dimensions in which we aim to harvest them at a younger age or at a shorter height, and thus make forests less susceptible. These are just one or two examples how we need to continue to develop these concepts of close to nature forest management. Otherwise, the idea to have a lot of different tree species and spread the risks, and also to have structurally diverse forests, which means we should always have already regeneration in the forest before the forest really matures. That is certainly something that we need to maintain or develop further, because it's important to have already regeneration there in case the mature trees die. Then we don't need to start from zero, which is always very difficult, but there's already a layer of trees that can respond to the release by the removal of the canopy.
And Andreas, we spoke before meeting, and you said that another aspect that you've seen in your research is that the number of trees, especially in water situations where you have water stress, can make a big difference in terms of the overall.
Yeah, this was already mentioned by Mr. Bahus. So this means that if you reduce the density of the trees in the forest stand, or if you reduce the number of large trees, then the demand of water is lower. That's clear, and so you can use under extreme events the risk that trees will die due to not enough available water. So this was exactly the point also which was mentioned by Jürgen Bahus.
Okay. I'm curious in terms of management. Each generation of scientists thinks that they're doing the best job that they can based on the data that they have, and later generations sometimes think that they've made a mistake. Are there risks involved in introducing species from other parts of the world or other parts of Europe to forests that haven't dealt with those species before? What are the potential downsides of this very active management style?
You want to go first, Markus?
I thought it would be maybe just fair to also remind that our past forests have, of course, been regenerated in a certain situation, like these large areas of spruce and pine forests we have in Germany, for example. Many of those were actually planted after large cuttings after the Second World War. And in that time, it would not have been very easy to actually regenerate more diverse species at that scale. And some of the other species are not suitable for planting in open areas. But now, of course, when you start changing species, we have to look at, do we have southern provenances which are more drought tolerant for some of our species? For example, for beech, there are southern provenances which we can test, but there's no practical experience with how they really cope with our local site conditions. And then when we use species from other areas, like Douglas fir has been used in Europe for more than 100 years, and it's growing very well, but it is subject to less natural disturbance factors than in its original range in the western part of the US. So there will be, with longer use and wider use of these introduced species, we also expect that new biotic threats will at some point arrive and also affect these species. So, but same thing actually happens with invasive species affecting our native species, like the cholera ash disease, which is affecting our ash trees, or other diseases of the maple. So we do have more invasive pests coming up, and they can affect also our native species, but they will definitely also affect our introduced species. So we can't plan for certainty for the future. We always have to expect surprises.
Absolutely. If I might just add, I mean, Markus said it already. I mean, there is a risk if we don't do anything, and there are risks if we do something. So there is no risk-free future. Our native trees are subject to introduced and pests and diseases, and this has been a huge factor in the past already. And owing to the global trade of goods, it will continue to be so. And likewise, if we introduce species, of course, they may also be susceptible to pests that they bring with them, or may be introduced. And that for that reason, it's very important that we check them extremely carefully. And it's certainly recommendable to work with those that we have already a long experience with, like the Douglas fir that was mentioned, or red oak, and avoid also mistakes of the past. So we need to be very certain that the species do not invade other ecosystems and take over ecosystems. There have been mistakes in the past, for example, with the import of black cherry from North America, which is clearly an invasive species in some of our native ecosystems. But when we look at species that are very close in terms of their evolutionary development to our native species, say oaks of Southern Europe, not just provenances that Markus mentioned, but species that are also closely related to our native species, then we can expect that they will also support a lot of the biodiversity that currently is associated with our native biodiversity. The insect herbivores, the mycorrhizal symbionts, and so on. So when we introduce new species, we need to check them very carefully to see what role they can play and what risks they are associated with. But it's not without risks.
Okay. We have a question from the audience that maybe I think applies to all three of your research, but maybe Andreas, you can lead off a general but very important question. If you had to pick out one impact of climate change that's the biggest threat to forests in Europe and then also tropical forests in other parts of the world? What is the number one issue?
Of the impacts of climate change. So drought is certainly, so for Europe, one very important topic. So as Marcus already told, so in northern countries in Europe, there could be even an increase in productivity of a forest if enough water is available. But for Central Europe and also for South Europe, it's very clear that this drought situation will create a high risk. And the same thing will be also in the tropics. But in the tropics, it's a combination between drought periods. But so normally there's a huge amount of rainfall in the tropics, but there are drought seasons, and there is an influence if these drought seasons are longer. So this changes the dynamics of these forests and has an influence. And we had 2005 in the tropics already in the Amazon a strong drought event. And due to this drought event, the Amazon forest switched from a carbon sink, which it is normally, to a carbon source. And the estimated emission of carbon was very, very high. It was in the order of 1 billion tons of carbon. This is really a huge number. And so for the tropics, also these drought conditions is a strong question concerning the stability of these forests.
I would add that the increasing variability is very, very dramatic, that there's not just a gradual change of climate that some people have expected earlier, but that we are seeing these much more extreme conditions, like now at the moment, this drought, which has been affecting large parts of Europe. But we are simply not having these very gradual changes, but we are having more extremes in both directions. We also have flooding affecting some forests and some landscapes. But this increased variability and less predictability of the future conditions, I think that's a major impact as well.
Because it's harder to deal with and account for, or because it takes a higher toll on the forests?
Well, we might have some years with increased productivity, but then if you have then 3 years of drought, then some of your species will not be able to survive that drought. So they might be growing very nicely in the years between, but then you have this extreme event, and then your system is just partly collapsing. And I think this combination of, on the one side we have CO2 fertilization, which is actually letting the plants grow a little bit better, which might also improve the water use efficiency of the systems to some extent. So these are some factors together with a longer growing season which increase productivity. But then if you have drought in between for a much longer period of time, then then the trees will suffer. And the disturbance factors are exploding because there's so many insects and other pathogens which are responding to the weakened trees then.
If I might chip in there, the last thing that Marcus mentioned is particularly important. Drought is related to so many other disturbances. With drought, we increase the susceptibility of forests to fire. We weaken the trees. They are stressed, so they become more susceptible to pests and pathogens. And drought typically in our regions here, at least in the temperate and boreal regions, typically comes also with heat, which also promotes insects more. And so it's these interactions between the different disturbance factors that make drought such a prominent factor.
I'd like to turn, there's another great question from the audience coming from two directions, and it really resonates for me, having grown up in California. I still have family there, and this summer, wildfires in the western US have obviously dominated life there. And wildfires have also become an issue in Germany, which I never expected when I moved here 15 years ago. What are some of the best practices on the one side to prevent wildfires? Is that a bad idea? Is prevention something we don't do anymore? And then if you can't prevent wildfires, what are the best ways to help forests recover from wildfire incidents?
Well, maybe I can start on this because we have been working quite a bit on the topic of wildfire management. I have a colleague who is an experienced wildfire manager who has been using prescribed burning in South Africa to help those systems better cope with extreme drought and fire risk. So you mentioned California, and part of the problem that we see in California is that the natural factor of fire has been excluded from the landscape there for a long time. So naturally, these systems have burned frequently, and also the Native Americans have used fire to actually have more productive grasslands for their to live from. So they have used fire in a much more proactive way. And now we are learning that we can't continue suppressing fires because with the climate change, the fires are getting much more extreme in terms of temperatures, energy released, the extreme heat we see with more than 40 degrees of temperature combined with violent winds is resulting in large mega fires which you can't really control anymore. So you can't stop those fires anymore, but you can do a lot of things to prevent such catastrophic fires from happening. So prescribed burning I mentioned before, which is a technique to remove or to burn some of the dead biomass. But you can also in systems like in Germany, you have to look at what kind of vegetation is dying next to, for example, roads or railway tracks. And by paying attention that these dead biomass is a potential ignition source for a fire, you have to pay attention that you try to minimize those dangerous fuels, especially in the surroundings of where people are, for example, going for camping and so on, and in the wildlife urban interface, you have to be aware where potential fire could happen because of neglect, and then that you prevent a negative spread of the fire.
In terms of recovery, I think you're muted.
I was instructed to mute my phone, but
you're back.
Yeah. So Markus said it implicitly, but I think it's important to stress that one needs to distinguish between ecosystems that have developed with fire as a disturbance factors and those that haven't. So where in systems like, in your home state, California, Oregon, or in many parts of Australia or the boreal forests, they have developed with fire, and there it makes little sense to prevent it. Also, in terms of biodiversity conservation, there are a lot of species that actually depend on this recurrent disturbance by fire. Whereas in, say, here, the temperate region, fires are not part of the system, only in exceptional sites, and thus prevention here would still make sense. And one of the most important prevention is to reduce the fuel load and the flammability of forests. Here we have our greatest problem with pine forests, which are in most parts secondary forests. Pure pine forests would naturally occur only on very exceptional pure sandy sites. So by mixing these forests with deciduous species or replacing them with deciduous species, we will reduce the flammability of forests in the landscape tremendously.
Okay. I'd like to turn a little bit to policy. And as we heard it at the beginning, from wildfires to the recent droughts, European forests and forests elsewhere are facing some immediate crises. And I wonder if there are ways that we can turn this crisis that we're experiencing into an opportunity. the news of the last few years has maybe focused the attention of policymakers on forests in a way that it hasn't been before. So, Andreas, maybe you could talk a little bit about lessons we might learn from forest management or forest certification schemes in the tropics.
So in the 90s, there was a huge pressure on the tropical forest due to logging activities, for example, in Southeast Asia. So in these tropical forests in Southeast Asia, there are a lot of tree species which have a high commercial value. And so there have been a lot of deforestation and also degradation. There had been also this conflict with oil palm plantations. So people wanted to establish oil palm plantation, and due to this, different people initiated the process of certification of forest management. So this was the time at which the Forest Stewardship Council started to establish a process to certificate forest management in a way that it don't overuse the forest, and that certain standards of protection and certain social standards will be reached in the forest management system, or in the forest management applied to the forest. And now currently, so such a certification system by the FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, has certified now more than 5% of all forests of the world, and this is, I think, a very good message. So there are possibilities to reduce the pressure on our forests by using, for example, these certification systems and promoting them. There are also other certification systems in Europe. There's another certification system which is often applied, but so this activity has increased a lot the focus and the public discussion on adapted forest management systems, which goes in the direction of a more sustainable use of forests.
Is that something that could be implemented or used as a way to encourage people to use close to nature silviculture in German forests? What are some ways to incentivize European forest owners and forest stakeholders to change the way they manage forests in a way that is going to set us up better for the future?
Yeah, maybe this is for Jürgen Barus. Yeah.
Go ahead, Markus.
So far, forest owners were mainly getting their income from selling wood. But what is now increasingly, with this focus on the forest dialogue, actually, and all the media attention, also people in society are more aware that there's other services from the forest which are also very important. And biodiversity protection, also the water protection and the use of forest for recreational use, all these services are provided for free. So if forest owners get some compensation for managing the forest in a way that it's better for biodiversity, that will take away some of the pressure that for economic reasons they so far have always prioritized conifers, which were the most marketable and best paid for tree species. So if they get incentives by, for example, payment for some services, which is now discussed also in Germany as a possible instrument for the future, then they will have other income streams which can then free up their decision making to also pay more attention to the non-wood production services from the forest.
Yeah, I would certainly stress that. I think this is very important. Here in Central Europe, forestry will definitely become less profitable. Forest owners that have managed their forests with an economic benefit did that mostly through management of conifer stands, and this model is breaking away, and thus there are also many forest owners who actually would like to diversify and provide other ecosystem services with a greater emphasis. And we as a society that have also demanded and benefited and still benefit from these ecosystem services may be in a position now where we should reward forest owners for that. And a source for that funding would, for example, be through the tax for carbon dioxide. Forest owners have and continue to do a great service through the sequestration of CO2 into their forests. And this tax on CO2 could be directly used to reward them for the service that they do to mitigate climate change.
It's a very capitalist view of the forest as sort of a service provider that we need to the forest is working for us somehow, but I guess that's the world we live in. Are there other policies? And Jürgen, I'm thinking specifically of increasing the amount of land devoted to forest reserves, or shifting the areas where we have public forests that would help in this situation.
Well, in Europe, we have a relatively small area of forests in reserves. And that has been addressed in recent forest policies. There are clear goals to increase that. We also see that in the new Green Deal of the European Union and the new biodiversity strategy there. It will help in some regards. The question is, whether it helps to adapt our forests to climate change. Certainly in the past, reserves, strict forest reserves that are not managed, have not been selected on the basis of this criterion. How resilient will they be in this position in the landscape to future climate change or to future disturbances? And as a result, many of the current reserves will actually be quite vulnerable to future impacts of climate change, to future disturbances. So simply increasing the area of reserves will probably not help. We also need to design reserves to make them also resilient for future conditions. And we may have to abandon some of the reserves that we have established in the past, although this would be fairly hard truth.
Are there specific types of design? I'm thinking last summer I was on the former border between Germany, East and West Germany, and it's sort of this accidental reserve, the Green Band project, that increases connectivity for wildlife and maybe for tree species. Is connectivity something that we need to address in terms of these future designs and just how we look at the landscape more broadly? Marcus, maybe you want to add to that.
Well, that is also an important point that we need to see. In order to allow species to migrate, we would need better connectivity. And if they can't move through the managed landscape, then they would need to have some stepping stones and some other structures to connect the habitats that they require. But I wanted to actually make another addition here, that besides the strict protection, we do have different management approaches which also favor biodiversity in the managed forest. And there will be a conference tomorrow and on Tuesday on exactly this topic, balancing forestry and biodiversity. And there's a network called Integrate Network, which has been set up in several European countries, where they try to look at examples how forest owners set aside, for example, old and large trees as habitat trees. They have special habitats which they protect and are not going to cut them anymore, in order to have more habitat for biodiversity and for threatened species. And there are ways to integrate these elements in production forestry, so you don't have then anymore this conflict that either you manage your forest for wood production or for biodiversity. Actually, there are good examples how you can combine both. And I think the future should be an increasing share of some strict protected forest, because we can afford to have more than 1 or 2%. We can have probably 3 to 5% without problems. But then we should also practice more this integrated forest management, where we also pay attention to important habitat features which we can protect in a managed landscape as well.
Andreas, it looked like you had something you'd like to add as well.
Yeah, so concerning connectivity, this is also a huge topic in the tropics. So due to the deforestation in the tropics, we get more and more forest fragments. So the deforestation rate is still high in the tropics. We lose around 0.5% of forest area every year. And we did 2 years ago a study published in Nature concerning the number of forest fragments we have already in the tropics. And we got a number of 150 million fragments. And much more important is that the border area of these forests is strongly increasing. So the current situation is that already 30% of the forest area is lying in a distance below 100 meters from the forest edge. So we have much more forest area due to this deforestation process and fragmentation process. And again, this has a consequence for biodiversity, so for the conservation of species, bird species, for example, but it has also an impact on the carbon balance of the tropical forest, because this we know that forests, tropical forest in the border area will degrade. So we will have a different microclimate, and there will be a higher tree mortality, and this creates or causes additional carbon emissions. So this fragmentation situation and ongoing deforestation is a huge topic in the tropics.
Okay. We have a few more questions from the audience, and one, we've been talking at a very macro scale, and one of the people watching wanted to know on a micro scale, what can members of the public, whether they're taking a walk in their local forest or going on a camping trip, do to leave a positive impact or help on a small level?
I mean, certainly.
Is that a question for you, Marcus? Or
Jürgen, please go ahead.
I mean, we all are basically culprits in terms of causing climate change. So whatever we can do to reduce our greenhouse gas emission footprint is welcome. So again, that's at a macro level, but we can all do that in our everyday life. And in forests, I think there are lots of ways you can help. At the moment, people can help with reforestation, replanting these damaged areas, approaching local foresters or forest owners who are in need of also manual support to do that. There are NGOs that do that. Bergwald, so the Mountain Forest Project, Bergwald Project in German, that seek volunteers who help with reforestation activities. So there are many ways that can be done.
And in the summer, when there's a lot of drought and heat, then be very mindful when you go through the forest, because there's still quite some instances of wildfire which are caused by neglect. And that is something that also the public should pay more attention to, that we have more often these very dry and hot conditions in the summer, and then it's important that the people walking in the forest are not causing problems, for example, by parking their cars on some dry grasses, which then might start burning. But yeah, I think the most important, I very much agree with Jürgen, the most important is that we talk about climate change impacts on forest. The more we can do on climate protection in terms of emission reductions, then we will hopefully have a manageable condition in the future, because it's a big difference between 1.5 degrees of warming or 2 degrees of warming compared to more than 3 degrees of warming, which we are currently on track to reach. So every degree of less warming will be much, much better to handle for the forest naturally, but also through active management.
Okay. We're running short of time. There's one last well, we have one last question, which is question disappeared. Are there any final thoughts that you guys would like to share before we close?
I think that what we are facing now, this crisis of forests in many parts of the world as a consequence of climate change, also raises the awareness of the public for the importance of forests and for their own benefits. We see this at the moment very dramatically here in the period of the second lockdown in Germany, where people flock again to the forests where they seek recreation and so on. I think it's time for a new deal between the public and the forest owners and forest managers for mutual support. For the one to support the activities in forests, and for the others to provide the services that the public really wants from forests. And that's what I would hope we get out of this.
Okay.
I would like to look at the global dimension, because climate change is a global problem. And we talked about tropical forests because Andreas is studying them very intensively. And I would like to stress that many of our actions, not only the emissions directly, but also, for example, the consumer choices, do have global implications. So when we want to protect tropical forests, then maybe we can do something to reduce the demand for soy and palm oil, which are drivers of deforestation still in many parts of the world. So I think when you try to do sustainable lifestyle choices, keep this global dimension in mind. That's a way we can actually influence also what happens with for example, tropical forests.
Andreas?
Yeah, I fully agree to Markus. So as consumer, we have a lot of influence also on the land use processes in tropical countries, because we buy products including oil palm products and so on. So there's a lot of connections between our economy and these countries. So this can have a strong impact. This is related also to the question of certification processes. Maybe one additional point to the end. So to better understand also the impacts of these extreme events with which our forests are more and more facing, we need also novel monitoring systems. At least this is my perspective. So we need faster monitoring systems which provides additional information about the conditions of our forests. So we need more the use of remote sensing data at high resolution to get better informed about these the impacts of disturbances and the change of the forest which is occurring due to climate change.
Okay. I think that's a great place to end our discussion today. I want to thank all three of you for being here and for your contributions to the discussion, and also to the work you're doing on this important topic. Also to the audience who's been tuning in and asking some really great questions. And finally to the organizers at Falling Walls who put this together and have made this discussion possible. I'd like you to check out some of the other circle tables. There's a great program of other programs that are on offer covering a really amazing diversity of topics, from science communication to research at the cellular level. And if you have interest today, I'll be moderating another panel this evening on the science of water. That's going to be really interesting. So please come back at 4 p.m. European time and join me for that. And if you missed this or would like to check out panels that happened in the past, or would like to just watch all of this again and really soak it in, these circle tables and the other offerings from Falling Walls are available at www.falling-walls.com. And please check out the website, and you can tap into some 200 plus events that have been put together this year in really innovative format that I think is opening the Falling Walls reach to audiences around the world. And yeah, thank you all. And that's it for us for today.
Thanks a lot.